over 50. There may be a few late seaters, but let's get started. Welcome to A Taste of Change. I'll introduce everyone in a moment, but wanted to just give you a warning that this is not your typical webinar, and it might make you hungry. But we wanted to start out with a quote about change, and there are many, but Emerson human capital is a bit on the irreverent side. So here's a fact and a quip. Change is inevitable except from the vending machine. So we'll be talking about change, and hopefully we're not eating too many of our meals out of a vending machine. But I am Elizabeth Russell. I direct Emerson Human Capital Change Leadership Practice and Strategic Communications Practice. Over the 25 years, I have observed and promoted behavior change in consumer products and healthcare and hospitality and deregulating utilities and high-tech and energy companies across the U.S. and 6 of those years in Asia. I really love our theme today because 2 reasons. One is I try new recipes with my friends, a controlled level of risk amongst friends, and experiment a little bit. So I do try new recipes and new foods. But secondly, I really love the immediacy of producing a meal. You get to see the results and eat the results. Unlike some change programs, which might take days or weeks to actually see the results. So food is near and dear to my heart. And I'd like to also introduce near and dear to my heart, my colleague, Harshna.
Thanks, Elizabeth, and thank you everyone for joining us. I was actually born and raised in South Africa, and I've been in the US just a few years now. I've been a change practitioner probably over about 10 years and worked with clients across finance, energy, mining, oil and gas, and public sectors on strategic change management. And you know, I actually found myself in this career because growing up in South Africa, we've seen a lot of change. And so I was really inspired and wanted to help companies really making that transition. And that's the reason why I went into change management. And I've actually seen, now that I've been here in the US for a few years, that change is hard no matter where you're from and no matter what background you're from. So I'm hoping that I can share a little bit of that with you today as well.
You've been here about 3 years now.
3 years.
We had to teach Harshna Southern U.S. culture and some new words.
All right, so now that we've introduced ourselves, it's your turn. So we want to know a little bit more about you. But before we get started with the session, I just want to give you a quick tour of WebEx, which is the tool that we're using. And so to the top right of your screen, you should be able to see a chat icon and a participants icon. And so if we ask you to chat with us, please be sure to select all participants, and then you can send a message in the text box below. So we'll also be conducting a few polls today, and when those open up, you should see it come up on your screen, and you'll have about 30 seconds to answer. So let's try putting that in action. What we'd like to know is your name, where you're located, and then also an example of something that's personal to you that's hard to change. So go ahead and get started with the chat function, and remember to select all participants.
Yeah, I think WebEx tells everybody your name, but won't tell you the location or your change challenge.
Wow,
Someone's husband.
The weather. My diet. I can relate to that one.
Can I change my teenager a little bit? Okay, a lot. Welcome, everybody.
Traffic.
Excellent. We've got both coasts covered.
Okay, so you said a teenager and someone says a toddler, so I guess all stages.
There's no difference.
Thanks, guys. Keep it coming.
There's a lot of campaigns across Georgia, stop texting and driving, and it is difficult in our crazy 24/7 world.
House color. Yeah, I've been trying to get my husband to change ours for some time now.
Excellent.
Great stuff.
Goals outside of work, for sure. We're going to have a mix of work and non-work related examples today.
Family dynamics.
For sure. Excellent. All right, well, welcome everybody. We got some good responses from our 67 participants today.
Awesome. Okay. So what's cooking? We'll be serving you a 3-course menu for managing change, Elizabeth and I. And after this webinar, we're hoping that you will be able to articulate the value of managing change. And so we have a nice little appetizer. And then we have a wine course because both Elizabeth and I are kind of red wine aficionados. And so we'll be using that time to describe some common change myths for you. And then finally, we have a special main course, which is applying the fundamentals of change planning to a familiar case. And then also, just to mention, Elizabeth and I will also be staying on for another half hour after our presentation for any questions that you might have. So that's what we have cooking in our kitchen today.
Excellent.
Now, if you're like me, I need a recipe to get cooking. So today we will be using the change recipe, which you can find in our Emerson change book, which some of you might be familiar with already. So before we get started with our cooking, let's go ahead and take a look at some key ingredients that can help us manage change effectively. And I'll give you a minute to just read over that. And now we're going to go to the polls and basically ask the question, which ingredients do you find are often most missing? Now, you can select from more than one option, but maybe just go with the top 2 or 3 that you think are often the most difficult to find.
Yeah. Brian, if you could open up the poll, that would be great. Perfect. Thank you. So again, you can check more than one answer, but what's challenging for you to find on your projects?
Once you've made your selection, just be sure to click Submit. There should be a Submit button at the bottom of the screen.
Yeah, later on in the session, we'll talk about how to mix these in.
So I think that Ryan's closed the poll now, so you should be able to see the results coming up.
Hit submit if you haven't already.
There we go. Okay, so it looks like we have a lot in the vision bucket.
Yeah, a lot in the vision bucket. It's interesting. There's not a lot in the dissatisfaction, which is something that we're going to talk about, the system being broken. But dissatisfaction with the status quo is sometimes difficult to find and to name. But vision is definitely a really #1 answer across most projects. And I'm also really pleased to see a heavy amount of answers on shared values and communication and involvement, and very importantly, desired behaviors. What are people expected to do in the future, and making sure those are really detailed and observable. Mm-hmm. I can't tell you the number of times people say, I just want people to be accountable. Like, well, what's that look like? What are they doing? What are they saying? We've got to get more specific on what we desire. Mm-hmm. But good experience knowing what you've seen and what's been hard to find in your cultures.
All right, thanks everyone for sharing. So we're going to move on to our first course, which is our appetizer course. And we're going to talk about, or at least define, what change management is. So we define change management as helping organizations capture a benefit opportunity by influencing human performance. And so for Elizabeth and I today, that means helping you, our diners, get the meal of a lifetime and creating a memorable experience.
Yeah, and benefit opportunity is just a way to say value, a growth, increase in revenue, improvement in productivity, but something that really matters, something of value we're going after. Otherwise, why manage it?
Right. So now that we've defined what change management is, let's go a little bit deeper. Every change begins with an event. And so, for instance, that could be introducing new technology, the introduction of a new strategy, adding or developing a new organization, or simply introducing a new skill that you want people to use. And so that event presents an opportunity to be successful at best, maintain status quo if we're lucky, or fail at worst.
Yeah, backsliding is the worst.
Yeah. Change has an expiration date. So just like canned goods, after the event there's energy when it's first introduced, but if you don't keep that momentum going, it can taper off or spoil. So people are very likely to evaluate the situation and make the assessment, is this dangerous for me or is this good for me? And as soon as they're done evaluating, you lose them. And you have between 90 to 180 days to make that impact. It's a pretty short window, but you have to really keep that momentum going.
Yeah, first impressions matter, and we do suspect change. Anything that's different will be considered, is this an enemy or not? And we've got to counteract that very quickly.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that we do as change professionals is really type change, and the size of the change matters. One, because it matters how much value you're going after. But two, it also helps you evaluate how complex that change is. And I will say, if you see a really complex change with not a lot of value, that should be a red flag, and you should stop. But referencing our change book, we really classified changes into, starting from the bottom, transactional, moving up the value chain to operational, and transformational. So transactional is a really more simple business process or a task change, like the steps to complete your time report have shifted, or shifting from filing hard copies to scanning documents. There's maybe a revenue opportunity or a cost savings, but there's a fairly clear shift from A to B. It's pretty defined. So that's more transactional. And then operational could be a large new system with a multitude of processes introduced with impacts. It could be a geographic expansion. So it's really a shift in business operations that has a number of process impacts that should be handled. So it's moving up the chain. It could have multi-million dollars in revenue or cost savings. And then finally, transformational, that's really moving like from a caterpillar to a butterfly, changing really who you are as a business. It could be a merger, it could be an org structure change, it could be a redefinition of roles, some sort of reinvention. The A to B may not be perfectly clear. You have to have a vision for a transformation, but you still might have to define the journey in detail as you go. Most transformations I've seen are a significant leap of faith, that we can envision ourselves as something different. And to be worth it, they need to be going after a lot of value. Again, if it's really complex and the value isn't clear, you should stop. But those are the sort of the types of changes and why they matter for change management. So some of the methods can cross these types, but we need to be very clear what kind of value we're going after. So Emerson has a change model. We also work with others, but this reminds us to focus on a few key principles. First of all, as we manage change to get the value, we know that we live as humans in an interdependent system. We live in organizations, but we also act as individuals. We know that we can set great plans, but we don't always sustain those plans. So this model reminds us to focus on the organizational shift, but also to make change personal at the individual level. We've got to get down to by job role, by person, because it's each person's understanding of what they must do differently to really participate in the change. And then our change plans will have 4 key principles, and they're not a 1, 2, 3 step. So first on the left, we must have a good strategy. So the purpose and the vision of the change must be very clear. It must be linked to the overall business strategy. There must be a good plan, and there must be consequences for not achieving the plan. So that's part of strategy that needs a lot of pull through the entire shift. And then on the far right side is the infrastructure or the sustainability. It's really popular. We all have had lots of great experiences building training or shifting processes or designing rewards and recognitions programs. Those are all part of the sustainability plan to make the environment appropriate and successful to keep that change going. So you think about sustainability along the way, and there's a lot of key tools and methods in sustainability. But really I want to focus on the center of the model because a lot of times these get forgotten. So internalization is identifying what behaviors need to change in a really specific way from leaders and from everybody. And we all make those behavior changes from the inside out. So identifying what behaviors we want leaders to show and demonstrate and what we want participants to follow. So that's about internalization and being very behavior driven. Finally is focus. Communications is really important, but this is how we direct attention to this change, particularly in a very busy world. So those are things that we do throughout change programs. And you could put a very simple project plan together, it really morphs across methodology. You essentially plan and engage people, you design and enable behaviors, and then you deliver and sustain. But you've got to keep these elements in mind all the way through. You could have come up with a great strategy and message at the beginning, and something in the environment changed, and you're going to have to refresh it or shift to new audiences. So really the change plan will have elements all the way through, and so we want to make sure that people don't just check off strategy at the beginning or worry about sustainability at the end. We're going to touch on some of these fundamentals later on in the webinar, but I want to close out this section to say, as we focus on the value, we need to focus on getting the benefits and making sure we understand what behaviors need to happen to get those benefits. Dollars don't fall out of the sky. Humans actually change their actions to get those. So what are the benefits? And guard against loss. Bad, half-implemented changes are very expensive and very messy. So we're also trying to guard against loss. And finally, we're trying to create a more agile workforce. Change will continue accelerating. So the final value of managing change is to create that agility for more and more change to come. So let's go on our second.
Yeah, so our second course, which we promised, is a wine course, and you can take your pick, either red or white, doesn't really matter. But
or lemonade, that's okay.
Oh yeah, that's fine too. So we're going to be describing some of the common change myths that exist out there. And as we do that, we're actually going to focus on these three different countries, Myanmar, United States, and Liberia. And we're going to be asking the question.
Yeah, let's open the poll.
Yeah, let's go ahead and open the poll. Ryan, what do these three countries have in common?
Not a deep thought, so just a few seconds to answer, so don't forget to hit submit.
And the choices are that they are the only the only countries with both stars and stripes in their flags, or these three countries produce the most cookbooks, or C, they are the only three industrialized countries that have not adopted the metric system, or all of the above.
Yeah, it looks like the time's up on the poll. Hit submit, and we'll see what you all think. These are linking to our first myth. Okay, well, we've got the popular answer C. They're the only three industrialized countries that have not adopted the metric system. That is true. They do have stars and stripes. And I think we got an answer about the cookbooks, which is perfectly on theme. But this leads us into our first myth. And it's a group of people will adopt an obviously good idea. This is the logic argument. And Harshna didn't grow up in the U.S. as I did and know what happened when we talked about the metric system in the early 70s, but it was introduced as an obviously good idea. But really, this is a myth. To change, something actually must be broken, or in this case, burned. So we stay in systems, relationships, routines until something breaks. And for those who don't know the logic of metrics, we're going to touch on this a couple times. There are a few earth facts that us Americans don't fully know. You may not know that a meter is 1/10,000th of the distance between the Earth, with the equator and the North Pole. Actually, didn't know it was so Earth-based. A centimeter is 100th of a meter. This is the one I always get right. A gram, or the unit of weight, is the weight of a cubic centimeter of water. Who knew that? Now, this all makes math easy. Unlike cups, inches, yards, quarts, pints, miles, pounds. So all this was super logical. So why didn't it get adopted? So the case here, and there may be a number of reasons why, but fundamentally, Americans in the early 70s weren't dissatisfied with cups and pounds, and no one described it to them as if they should be dissatisfied truly with cups and pounds. So there was a globalist message and some things that were and weren't done, and we'll focus on that in a second. But finding or naming what's broken can one be the most awkward steps in change management. As much as we'd rather focus on the bright, shiny future or some logical good idea, we need to be pushed away from today's by saying something is broken or burned. And we focused on this in messaging. Those that attended our last webinar learned this a bit, but it's also just simply fundamental to change. We have to find words to describe today's brokenness, like we've neglected a key product or brand, or our siloed organization is leading to costly mistakes, or failed relationships. Economic realities force us to close doors unless we reinvent. We've got to talk about what's broken to spur behavior. So good ideas and logic aren't enough. If it were, we'd all be thin, exercising, non-smoking, recycling health nuts. So now that we've debunked that good idea myth, Harshna, you take myth 2.
Okay, so myth 2 is that the key to changing behavior is communication. And you'd be forgiven if you're scratching your head at this one, because everyone always says communication, communication, communication. But the truth is that it's really about focusing attention. Most people go into change saying, let's create a communication plan. That's the first thing they do. Well, it's about communication, but it's not the only tool on our workbench. It's just one tool that we use. What's really, really key is that we focus attention on the right behaviors and reinforcing those behaviors, because those behaviors, when reinforced, actually build on the culture that we want. So, but going back to communication, it is a powerful tool. We shouldn't forget that. And I think that what's really key here is that when we do communicate, we make sure that it's timed, so that people get the right messages at the right time. It's measured, so it's not too much, it's not too little, and it's specific. So everyone gets the right communication tailored for their specific role. And another thing that's really important with communication is that we really make those connections between the heart and the mind. And we can do that by drawing on metaphors and stories to really reinforce those key messages and focus attention.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, there's so much clutter out there. We have to get focused on the most important things. Okay, myth number 3. This is really popular. We must change the culture. We know that culture matters and it can impede change, so we naturally say, well, let's change it. But the truth is we have to leverage the culture we have. And culture is very immovable. It's like the immune system of the organization. It knows what the organization is and what it's not. It will attack the challengers and protect its favorites. So culture is sort of the unspoken or unwritten rules about how work gets done. So we keep culture in the forefront because it makes or breaks an idea. Mark Fields, when he was transforming Ford Motor Company, said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And I've often seen where culture meets design, culture always wins. So we talked about good ideas being dismissed because the current system wasn't broken. They are also dismissed or ignored, like the body rejects an organ donation. So you can harness the culture like a dam harnesses a waterfall, but first by understanding it, and then by plotting a course that plays to its strengths. So here's another food that's not really here for the food matter. So Apple Computer is an example of a brand that's very familiar. So use your text chat and tell us in 1 or 2 words, what's the essence of this brand? What probably describes its workforce? And if you're from Apple, you can be more authoritative than others, but I think we all have a sense of this brand. So text chat in some answers about what you think is the essence of this brand and probably its workforce. Quality, new ideas, simple, innovative, creative, think different,
modern,
fresh, innovation, creative, limitless, leading, user-friendly, taking risks, definitely, hip and creative, driven, definitely. Well, it'd be fun to do a change plan for them. And these cultural truths are inherent in the brand. So if you say change that culture, that's really killing the golden goose. You can't and shouldn't really do that. So you have to find a way to work with your innovative, nimble, creative, risk-taking culture. So if you're Apple and you need to position change, you need to work with it and not squelch it. So you may have a real legitimate need to up compliance or up safety. So while those are important, if you just say, hey, follow these rules or be safer, that will go over like a lead balloon. Harshna talked about focusing attention. It's easy and natural for us to screen out messages that fall into a culture's blind spots. But defining problem statements that resonate with the culture, like we can't get our bold designs out to market faster unless we fix these processes, that can frame it in a way that they would appreciate and pulls with the culture. If they're all about being bold and getting designs out there faster, we need to define the problem as an impediment to what they want to do. So that's just part of leveraging the culture you have.
So the next myth is we need the organization to buy into our idea. And very often that's what we strive to do as change practitioners is, we go in with the mindset that we want to get everyone on board. But really the truth is that we need the early adopters.
For sure.
Once you get the first 10% to prove that the change is safe, 15% will jump on board, and then the next 35%, and so on and so forth. And I mean, I remember, Elizabeth, you just referred to Apple, and I remember with the iPhone and the iPod and everything, people that were really tech savvy kind of dived in first, and then everybody else, kind of followed suit. But this reminds me of a friend of mine who jumped on the kale bandwagon early on. So she did her research, she came up with at least 5 different ways of using kale. And she introduced it at her dinner parties, and we were like, wow, what is this, this fabulous new food? Granted, there's going to be 10 to 15% that won't buy in, no matter what you do and how hard you try, but you can't worry about them. They're going to suck away all of that energy, and the early adopters and those who listen to them won't be deterred. So my early adopter friend was the reason I started using kale, and she was part of the movement where it's now somewhat of a fixture in today's salads and smoothies throughout kitchens in the US and beyond, probably.
Now, some of the food in this presentation makes me hungry. Confession, kale doesn't. It doesn't. I was not an early adopter there, but I have tried it. So finally, our last myth is a really popular one. There has to be a drop in performance when you introduce a change. This is classic. This was the valley of despair. Give everyone time to catch up before introducing more change, and that performance drops are a given. We simply have a different model. So new change agents realize that most companies can't afford to lose productivity when going through a change. It's imperative to keep up with ever-changing technologies and consumer demands. And to do that, companies have had to become more athletic and agile. It's evolve and change or die. So what this model tells us to do is plan and pilot, scale quickly, and keep performing and keep climbing. So it's a mindset more than a model to keep climbing and keep changing. Now, a restaurant going through a menu change is under incredible pressure to perform at its peak for every lunch and every dinner shift, or risk losing its business to the place next door. So in new thinking, there's no tolerance for these long change cycles that look somewhat like this. Here's the traditional change model, that valley of despair, where there will always be a different productivity and a different morale. When change happens, then all we could possibly do is try to shorten and lessen that dip. But again, that's old thinking, and we have to learn how to change faster. And so in a different model, we focus on stepping up to change proactively. Pilot it small, move it, scale it, keep moving. And to do this, we focus on two things. One is kind of employee fitness, helping them build more personal resilience for accepting and managing successive and repeated changes, because that's just the way the world works now. And also the company support before, really ideally before, during, and after a major change, including training and communications and policies and processes and right culture and coaching to help people move through change faster and expect it and thrive on it. So we just live in a world of constant climbing. So we have been moving away from this mindset and myth that there always necessarily has to be a different performance. Okay, let's move on to our third course. It's really more of our main course. Now that we've had some wine and myths, we want to bring to life three fundamentals of change planning. So back to the metrics case, the answer on the earlier poll was that these three countries had not adopted the metric system. And you may or may not know that 39 years ago, the U.S. adopted in Congress the Metric Conversion Act of 1975, and it was introduced in the name of logic and globalism to move us away from the English imperial system of weights and measures. And I suggest this is a change plan gone bad. 39 years and counting is indeed a failure. So we're not going to bash our elementary school teachers from the 70s. There really was a stacked deck against them for this change. But I am curious about what you all think, either because you heard something or you lived through this period. Let's open up the poll and make sure we've got enough time for the poll. So let's open up the poll and say, why do you think it was so hard for Americans to adopt to the metric system in the early 70s? So it's a bit of a dated question, and it is opinions, and opinions can vary. But we want to talk about 5 of these reasons. Some we've talked about already, and a couple we're going to talk about going forward. But in the context of metrics, tell us what you think was the most key reason, in your opinion, of why this change introduction failed. You know, we have such a hybrid now. Even in one recipe, I'll see a mix of grams and cups.
Yeah, I'm still struggling with that. I'm still struggling with that. I still have recipe books from South Africa that I brought with me, and I have to constantly get out my converter and do the calculations and everything. So I know how it feels.
Yeah, I will share an accident story. There are some consequences to being a messy hybrid. Okay, I hope people had enough time. So the answers that we got were all very much heavily focused on culture, a culture of pride. Also, no ties to something early or personal success, excellent. Didn't leverage familiarity, we're actually going to talk about that point. And it was voluntary instead of mandatory, absolutely. Didn't outline the cost of failure, that was a good one as well. So there really was a smattering. So answers A through C are 3 key fundamentals that we're about to talk about. Making change familiar, making it feel successful, and having a degree of control around it. Letter C is for control. So we're going to talk about those 3 main dishes. Now, D and E actually touch on the myths that we've been talking about already. So didn't outline the cost of failure, something needed to be broken, and E was the culture, and it was trying to change the culture as it went. So the first three answers are the fundamentals that we're about to talk about, and the other two were definitely myths and gotchas. So they're all good answers. Okay, so considering family style, if you've got three different dishes on the table, so we don't count anniversaries of failed changes gone to the graveyard. We're going to sample a few ideas. And again, they're called familiar, successful, and controlled. And we need all of these as we mix up a good change plan. So here's our base plan again, that you have planning elements, design elements, and delivery elements. And when you're planning, you may all know that you have to know who are the early adopters and what you need them to do. You need to figure out how to help them along and achieve results that show success before the expiration date. But what goes into the design? What goes in the center there? And these are ideas, art and science going on here, that subscribe to these three fundamentals. So we're going to start with familiar. So we've moved away from the food for a little while. So any change, we perceive it as initially scary. Our brains are just built that way. And we can combat this with creating connections to what is known and comfortable. Past successes, the good old days, how can we recapture something that was good? So remember we talked about the metric system failure. We've actually, because given that we are true change geeks, kind of sat down around and talked about what we could have, should have, would have done if we were doing this now. And one way to make something familiar is to tie it to something comfortable and beloved. Grandma's cookies, if you're baking, how could they be better, or how could you scale them for the entire company or your neighborhood if you could convert that recipe? We have advertisers that do this all the time. They introduce new products with spokespeople that have nothing to do with the products, but they're familiar and they're trusted. So advertisers have been doing this to us forever. They're invoking star appeal and familiarity to focus on a new and improved behavior, perhaps a purchasing behavior. So if you were trying to get today's cooks or your mom to go metric, you might have celebrity cooking shows. You might convert grandma's recipe. I hear that Iron Chef already yells at people for not using metrics. So while the shouting method doesn't work for us all, star appeal, including your star leaders, clearly does. But most importantly, we have to tie a change to something known and comfortable. It's good to be able to say, remember when. And I always ask, what are the past successes that you want to tie to your current change? Now, there's a reason that we parents love to buy DVDs of our favorite childhood TV shows. We think, and I think, these shows must be good for them because they are familiar. The next fundamental is really keep it controlled. And we control through processes and environment. So while we need to help people change constantly, we as individuals need assurance that we won't fall or fail. And so as we look at processes, we also talk about how to update roles and responsibilities to tell people how and when they should do a new behavior. Sometimes we put controls in systems. I remember when I first got a Mac, there was a, are you sure you want to delete this file? We put controls in our environment to keep us safe. And so designing processes can and should include small everyday habits. So when a safety culture was introduced at one of our clients about 13 or 14 years ago, it started with taking a moment at the beginning of every meeting to review a tip or a recent event as building a clear, small habit and something into the process to focus attention. Another client of ours started increasing its technology savviness by sharing nuggets of insight routinely and proactively during team meetings and also with its business partners to really help them learn along the way and create that habit and that image that they are constantly focused on new technologies and innovation. So the metric story, as I promised, actually did have an element of some failed controls. And so as we live in this hybrid world of really voluntary compliance for metrics, there was at least one disaster. NASA had a Mars orbiter burned up on re-entry, into the atmosphere when an engineering team provided the specs in pound force newtons instead of the requested metrics. Now, there was no loss of life, but it was a $125 million loss. So controls make us safe. Voluntary doesn't always work. And actually throwing away our old systems and tools can also be helpful. Another story, it was about in New York, where as our health craze thinks about new and different ways to fight obesity, architects have been asked in New York how to make our buildings just a little bit healthier. Not by going green this time, but encouraging more stair taking. We know that even a few stair steps a day can make the difference. Now, stairs used to be the most architecturally interesting part of buildings, but recently they've become dark and windowless afterthoughts. So bringing them back to that environment might prompt healthier habits. And so if all this food talk has made me think about hitting the stairs are going to come into our last fundamental as well. So we keep the control through our environment and our processes, but we really fundamentally have to start with success. So a feeling of success gives us confidence and breeds more success. So New York is taking stairs by physically changing the environment. Some of you may have seen Volkswagen fun theory experiments. They're out on YouTube. And they rewarded with success by making the behavior change fun. Now, fun is a clear reward. Behavioral scientists love to explore the power of fun. So they set up an experiment in a subway next to an escalator where the regular stairs were replaced with piano stairs. So you hit a note as you took each step. People started jumping around and playing tunes. But there was an immediate fun reward to taking the stairs. Another fun theory experiment was with recycling, constructing a recycling bin like an arcade game. So the usage went way up as people were rewarded with lights and points and sounds with every deposit of a can or a bottle. So besides having fun rewards or immediate rewards, we all need to have a feeling of success. And so that's why in our change plans, we're always looking for what can you do early on? What is the quick win? If you've got 6 changes to make in an overall program, it's really tempting to go for the biggest, hardest one at first, because maybe it's the longest pole in the tent. But to the point of change having an expiration date, people need to see some results early on in order to get those next few adopters to jump in the pool with you. And so you've got to focus on the quick win. And what would people who you want to adopt feel success? Maybe they felt heard, but what would keep them feeling success as we go? So those are 2 fundamentals there for feeling success and seeing what can happen early on and having a little fun with it all. One last story here that actually is in the cooking theme. As companies in the late 60s and early 70s were trying to introduce the cake mix, ironically, they were trying to teach us to stop baking, or quite so much. And they started with the question of what would mostly housewives make them feel successful if they stopped baking cakes the traditional way. There was a concern that if this was a cake for a loved one, that they wouldn't have put in the effort or the initiative to bake a cake. And so when they did research about what would it take for people to feel successful, like they were still contributing and doing something special for a loved one, they realized that they withheld a couple of ingredients from the mix, like the oil and the eggs. The act of breaking an egg made the baker feel like they really were successful in baking the cake. So they could adopt the new product, they would feel successful in using it, but they were still having a familiar habit. And then they shifted people's attention to cake decorating contests, and the rewards of making the cake faster meant they could spend a whole lot more time on the personalization and the specialization of that cake. And I never thought about it that way, that they essentially taught us to stop baking, and they easily could have put the egg ingredient in a freeze-dried form. into the cake mix. But they started with what would we feel was making us successful and worked with that. So we start with successful. I don't know if I'll start taking more stairs. I should. But that was the key fundamental, that we get that. We want that. To foster repetition, we need sort of new grooves formed in the brain. And in order to do that, we need to get rewarded long enough that we start repeating it long enough so it becomes a habit. So if you want to start running and you love coffee, you could reward yourself by running 5 miles to the coffee shop. Coffee has nothing to do with running. The rewards don't actually have to be that related to the behavior you have, but it needs to be positive and it needs to be immediate. Habits that get rewarded get repeated.
You know, on your cake example, Elizabeth, I have to say my mom can spot the difference. She still makes every recipe from scratch, and if somebody makes one of those cakes out of a box, she knows the difference.
Well, there's a whole cookbook industry that has launched, starting with cake mixes, and they really can be fabulous.
Oh,
So
I love it.
It's like a whole new industry. It's a whole new product category.
I can't bake. I mean, that really does, put something on the table that.
Well, I prefer ice cream.
So today we gave you 3 tastes of change management, and hopefully we haven't ruined your lunch or your dinner or your appetite or anything like that. I know I'm feeling a little bit hungry, but so we had an appetizer where we articulated the value of managing change, and that really means going after the big benefits, but also guarding against big risks. And we explored some, 5 myths to be exact of managing change, and we also looked at the fundamentals and applied that to familiar control successful.
Well, speaking of spoiling lunch, though, I am throwing in dessert.
Oh, wonderful.
And this actually is not as healthy as kale. So we hope you enjoyed our tasting menu. But for dessert, I've got to tie back to culture. And remember, culture is the unwritten rules for how work gets done. You can have the greatest plan, the most creative design, but you still can fail. So I got a first-class illustration of unwritten cultural rules when my son returned home from camp counseling. Apparently, he's going to get promoted to a junior counselor next year, and he said, well, I have to take a second trunk to camp next year. I said, well, why on earth would you have to do that? Oh, well, I have to bring a whole trunk full of candy bars and sodas and chips. And I said, well, isn't this the camp that doesn't want you to take all that stuff? And there's an official policy. I've read the handbook. I am hopelessly a rule follower. How is this right? He said, oh, well, we use this for prizes for campers and maybe some bribes for cabin inspections. And so this is just what we do. So apparently this really is how work gets done at camp. And perhaps I, as a parent, aren't really supposed to know, but I'm fairly sure that I'm going to be the one in Costco buying all of this junk food that he's supposed to take to camp for my newly promoted counselor. So, however, I do know as a mom for a long time that candy bars do have power. However, power in one culture is dismissed in another. So bottom line, for dessert, don't overlook the written rules and watch out for the food that you send to camp. So we're happy to stay on the line afterwards. We have sent a lot of different tastes and flavors your way, and we're positioned here to stay on the line for text questions. If you're interested, drop us an email with a question. If you'd like to have a copy of the presentation, just send us an email and we'll send that along to you.